The Australian SAS trooper lies motionless in the rotting undergrowth of Phuoc Tuy Province. His face is caked with mud so thick it has cracked like old leather. His uniform has not seen soap in 12 days. The jungle around him is silent except for the drip of moisture from the canopy above. He cannot see the trail. He cannot hear footsteps. But his hand slowly moves to his rifle. He whispers to his mate 3 meters away. Americans coming. His mate does not question this. He does not ask how. He simply readies his weapon and waits. 30 seconds later, the smell hits him too. Clean soap, menthol shaving cream, the unmistakable chemical sweetness of American tobacco. The scent cuts through the jungle rot like a lighthouse beam through fog. 2 minutes after that, a 4-man American patrol emerges from the tree line. They never see the Australians. They walk past within 15 meters. The SAS troopers let them go. They are not the target. But the lesson is seared into memory. The Yanks might as well have been carrying a neon sign. This was not an isolated incident. This was Vietnam in 1966, 67, 68. This was the invisible war within the war. And this was why the Australian Special Air Service Regiment developed a reputation that even the Americans had to respect. The diggers did not fight clean. They did not smell clean. And that is precisely why they came home. The problem started, as so many problems do, with good intentions and unlimited resources. The United States military in Vietnam was the most lavishly supplied fighting force in human history. Every firebase had hot showers. Every patrol base had a PX stocked with candy bars, cigarettes, and aftershave. Every soldier received a personal hygiene kit that would have made a suburban housewife proud. Dial soap, Colgate toothpaste, Menon Speed Stick deodorant, Gillette shaving cream, Lucky Strikes or Marlboros by the carton, juicy fruit gum, bug spray with enough DEET to strip paint off a Buick. The thinking was simple. Keep the boys comfortable. Keep morale high. A clean soldier is a happy soldier. The thinking was also catastrophically wrong. The Vietnamese jungle is not a forest. It is a living organism. It breathes. It sweats. It stinks of decay, of rotting vegetation, of stagnant water, of animal droppings, of moss and mold, and the slow decomposition of everything that was once alive. A man who spends a week in the jungle without soap begins to smell like the jungle. His sweat takes on the same sour, earthy odor as the undergrowth. His clothes become saturated with the same musty dampness. He becomes, in the most literal sense, invisible to the nose. But the American soldier carried his civilization with him like a portable suburb. The combination of industrial soap, petroleum-based deodorant, mint toothpaste, and Virginia tobacco created what Australian veterans would later describe as a chemical cloud. This cloud did not dissipate politely. The heavy jungle air held it in suspension. The moisture amplified it. A light breeze could carry the scent of an American patrol 200 meters through the trees. On a still day, with the right humidity, some veterans claimed they could detect Yankees from 300 meters or more. The Viet Cong knew this. The North Vietnamese army knew this, and they used it. Ordematismatieke. But how did the Australians figure this out? The answer begins in the swamps of Borneo and the jungles of Malaya, years before the first American combat troops splashed ashore at Da Nang. The Australian SAS had been fighting in Southeast Asian jungles since the Malayan emergency of the 1950s. They had learned their trade against communist insurgents who had spent decades living in the jungle, who knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place. These were not enemies who could be overwhelmed with firepower. They had to be outthought, outweighted, and outhunted. The Australians learned that in the jungle, patience was a weapon, silence was a weapon, and invisibility was the greatest weapon of all. When the regiment deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they brought this hard-won knowledge with them. They also brought a philosophy that was utterly foreign to the American way of war. Less is more. Quiet is deadly. Comfort kills. The standard SAS patrol in Vietnam consisted of 5 men, sometimes 4, occasionally 3. They carried no radios except in emergencies. They moved no more than a few hundred meters per day. They spent hours sitting motionless, watching, listening, smelling. Their mission was reconnaissance, not combat. They were there to find the enemy, track his movements, identify his camps, and call in the bombers or the infantry. They were ghosts, and ghosts do not use soap. The preparation for a long-range patrol began days before the helicopter insertion. The process was called sanitization, but it had nothing to do with cleanliness. Quite the opposite. First, the soap went. Not just the fancy American stuff, but all soap. Troopers stopped washing with anything except plain water. Their skin became coated with a film of natural oils, sweat, and grime. Within 3 days, the chemical residue of civilization began to fade from their pores. Second, the toothpaste went. Mint and fluoride have distinctive smells that linger on the breath for hours. SAS troopers brushed with water only, or used a twig from a local tree. Third, the cigarettes went. This was the hardest sacrifice for many. Vietnam-era soldiers smoked like factory chimneys. But the smell of tobacco smoke in the jungle was a beacon. Worse, the nicotine withdrawal made men irritable and shaky for the first few days. The regiment demanded that troopers quit smoking at least a week before a patrol. Some never started again. Fourth, the insect repellent went. American troops slathered themselves with military-issue bug juice containing N-diethyl metatoluamide, better known as DEET. The stuff worked brilliantly against mosquitoes. It also announced your presence to anyone with a functioning nose within 100 meters. The SS endured the bites. They endured the leeches. They endured the ants and the centipedes and the things that crawled. They reckoned a few welts were better than a bullet. Fifth, the food changed. This was the most radical adaptation. American sea rations were engineering marvels of shelf-stable nutrition. Ham and lima beans, beef stew, spaghetti and meatballs, pound cake and peaches. Every can reeked of preservatives, processed meat, and the factories of Ohio. SAS patrols experimented with eating local food in the days before a mission. Rice, nuoc mam, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Vietnamese cooking. Garlic, chili. The theory was simple but unsettling. If your sweat smelled like a Vietnamese peasant, you might be mistaken for a Vietnamese peasant, at least for a crucial few seconds. The result was a squad of men who looked and smelled like something that had crawled out of a swamp. Their uniforms were stiff with dried mud. Their hair was matted. Their skin was grey with accumulated filth. They were magnificent. The contrast with American Special Operations Forces could not have been starker. The US Navy SEALs and Army Green Berets in Vietnam were superb soldiers. No Australian would deny that. They were fit, motivated, expertly trained, and equipped with the finest weapons money could buy. But they operated under a different doctrine. American Special Forces ran shorter missions. They had helicopter extraction on call. They had fire support from gunships and artillery. They did not need to be invisible for 2 weeks because they were never alone for 2 weeks. But When American units requested joint patrols with the Australian SAS, problems emerged quickly. The first issue was noise. American troops were accustomed to moving at a pace that would have given an SAS sergeant a heart attack. They crashed through undergrowth. They talked. They swore when they tripped. The Australians communicated in hand signals and whispers so soft they were barely audible at 2 meters. The second issue was discipline. American patrols expected to smoke during rest breaks. They expected to eat hot food heated over solid fuel tablets. They expected to wash their faces with a wet cloth. The Australians ate cold rations from a pouch, chewing each bite for minutes to avoid the sound of crunching. But the third issue was the one that could not be negotiated. The smell. An SAS patrol leader in Phuoc Tuy, whose name remains classified to this day, reportedly told an American liaison officer in blunt terms, "You stink of soap. You stink of cigarettes. You stink of America. We can smell your patrol from the other side of the ridge. So can Charlie. You are not coming with us." The Americans were, by some accounts, offended. By other accounts, they were intrigued. A few took the lesson to heart and began adopting Australian methods. Most did not. The culture gap was simply too wide. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were not sophisticated in the way that Western armies understood sophistication. They did not have electronic surveillance. They did not have satellite imagery. They did not have computers or code-breaking machines. But they had something far older and in some ways far more effective. They had human senses refined by generations of jungle living. Former Viet Cong soldiers interviewed after the war confirmed what the Australians had suspected. They could smell American patrols. The combination of soap, tobacco, and insect repellent was so distinctive, so utterly foreign to the jungle environment, that it might as well have been a siren. One former guerrilla, speaking to an Australian journalist in the 1980s, described it this way: "When the wind carried that smell, we knew we had time. Time to prepare an ambush. Time to move our supplies. Time to disappear." The Americans were strong. They had many guns, but they told us they were coming. The same guerrilla was asked about the Australians. His answer was chilling. The Australians were different. We did not smell them. We did not hear them. Sometimes they were there, and we only knew when our men did not come back. This was the terror that the SAS inspired, not the terror of superior firepower, the terror of the unknown, of enemies who materialized from nowhere and vanished into nothing, of patrols that passed within meters of VC camps without being detected, only to call in an airstrike hours later when they were safely away, of men who seemed to have become part of the jungle itself. The science behind this was not fully understood at the time, but modern research has confirmed what the diggers learned through trial and error. The human nose contains approximately 400 types of scent receptors. A trained nose can distinguish over 1 trillion distinct odors. In an environment where background smells are constant and familiar, any foreign scent stands out with startling clarity. The jungle has its own olfactory signature: decomposing leaves, stagnant water, flowering plants, animal musk. A person who lives in this environment becomes attuned to its normal range of smells. Anything outside that range triggers an alert. Industrial chemicals are the ultimate outsiders. Sodium lauryl sulfate, the foaming agent in most soaps, leaves a residue on skin that continues to release volatile compounds for days. Triclosan, an antibacterial additive common in 1960s toiletries, has a distinctive medicinal smell. Menthol from toothpaste and shaving cream evaporates slowly in humid air. And tobacco smoke contains over 7,000 chemical compounds, many of which cling to clothing and hair for weeks. An American soldier who showered with soap, shaved with cream, brushed his teeth, and smoked a cigarette was carrying a chemical payload that simply did not belong in the jungle. He was a walking anomaly. To anyone whose nose was calibrated to the local environment, he was obvious. The Australian solution was brutal, but effective. Stop adding foreign chemicals to your body. Let your natural smell reassert itself. Accept the discomfort. Accept the filth. Accept the insects and the itching and the feeling of your own skin crawling. Do this, and you disappear. Of Hawking. The deeper you go into the Australian experience in Vietnam, the more you realise how fundamentally their approach differed from the American model. Take the question of food. The American logistical machine could deliver hot meals to fire bases in the middle of nowhere. This was a genuine marvel of military supply. But it also meant that American troops became accustomed to eating well. Their bodies processed American food. Their sweat carried the byproducts of American food. Their very chemistry was American. SAS patrols in the bush ate what they called ration packs, which were themselves designed for minimum smell. But some units went further. They consumed local food when possible. They chewed betel nut, which Vietnamese peasants used as a mild stimulant. They ate rice cooked without salt or seasoning. The goal was metabolic camouflage. If your body processed the same food as the local population, your sweat would carry similar compounds. You would smell, at least partially, like you belonged. Was this taken to extremes? Probably. Some veterans tell stories that strain credulity. Patrols that ate nothing but local vegetation for a week. Men who rubbed themselves with jungle mud, not just for camouflage, but to mask their scent. Troopers who claimed they could smell the difference between North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas based on diet. How much of this is fact, and how much is the embroidery of decades of retelling is impossible to say. But the core principle is documented and verified. The Australian SAS understood olfactory warfare. They practiced it systematically, and it worked. This brings us to the uncomfortable comparison that no American veteran wants to hear, but which the historical record supports. The Australian SAS in Vietnam suffered one of the lowest casualty rates of any unit in the conflict. Over the entire war, the regiment lost approximately 50 men to combat and accidents combined. This from a force that conducted thousands of patrols deep in enemy territory, often for weeks at a time, with minimal support. American Special Operations units, by contrast, suffered significantly higher casualties despite superior firepower and support. The reasons were complex. Different missions, different areas of operation, different enemy concentrations. But Australian veterans who served alongside Americans offer a simpler explanation. The Yanks were brave. No question. But they could not be quiet. They could not be patient. And they could not be invisible. They fought like Americans. They fought with overwhelming force. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the jungle swallowed them whole. The Australians fought like hunters. They fought like the prey that had learned to think like the predator. They fought dirty and quiet and slow, and far more of them came home. One story captures the difference perfectly. In 1967, an American reconnaissance team was inserted into an area of Phuoc Tuy Province that the SAS had been patrolling for months. The Americans were experienced soldiers. They were not fools. They were simply American. On their second day in the bush, they were ambushed. The Viet Cong had been tracking them since insertion. They had followed the smell. The firefight was short and brutal. 2 Americans were lost. The survivors were extracted under fire. A week later, an SAS patrol went into the same area. They spent 14 days in the jungle. They located 3 VC base camps. They called in airstrikes that eliminated 2 of them. They killed 4 enemy soldiers in a silent close-quarters engagement that lasted less than 30 seconds. They were never detected. They suffered no casualties. When the patrol returned to base, they were so filthy that the quartermaster refused to handle their uniforms. The clothes were burned. The men were hosed down like cattle before being allowed into the mess hall. The patrol commander, a sergeant with 3 tours under his belt, summed it up this way: "The Viet Cong are not stupid. They know the jungle. They know how to hunt. If you want to beat a hunter, you have to stop being prey. You have to stop smelling like prey. You have to stop thinking like prey." He paused, then added with a grin that showed teeth yellow from betel nut, "You have to become the thing they are afraid of. All is in..." The lessons of Vietnam were not lost on the Australian military. In the decades that followed, the SAS refined its doctrine of olfactory discipline into a formal training requirement. Recruits learned not just how to move silently and shoot accurately, but how to manage their body chemistry for extended operations. They learned which foods created the strongest scent signatures. They learned how long it took for soap residue to dissipate from skin. They learned the smell profiles of different nationalities, different diets, different hygiene routines. This knowledge proved valuable in conflicts far from the jungles of Southeast Asia. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the thin air carried scents for kilometres, Australian Special Forces continued to practice chemical discipline. In the deserts of Iraq, where enemy sentries could smell cigarette smoke from half a kilometre away, the old lessons were relearned. The Americans, too, eventually adapted. Modern US Special Operations units have incorporated scent discipline into their training, though the extent varies by unit and mission. Some credit Australian influence directly. Others arrived at the same conclusions through their own painful experience. But the principle remains the same. In the close world of patrol warfare, where contact is measured in metres rather than miles, the nose knows. Oikos riolicus. And what of the veterans themselves? The men who spent weeks caked in mud and filth, who ate cold rice and fish sauce, who let leeches gorge on their blood rather than risk the smell of insect repellent. Most are old men now, those who are still alive. They gather at reunions and tell stories that their grandchildren cannot quite believe. They remember the fear and the boredom, the endless waiting and the sudden violence. They remember mates who did not come home. They remember the particular horror of jungle warfare, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, where the land itself seemed hostile. But they also remember the pride, the quiet, unspoken pride of having mastered a form of warfare that defeated enemies with 10 times their resources, the pride of having outthought, outweighted, and outhunted some of the most formidable guerrilla fighters in history, the pride of having done it the hard way, the Australian way, with minimal support and maximum ingenuity. When they talk about the smell, they laugh. The filth becomes a badge of honour. The discomfort becomes proof of commitment. The soap becomes a punchline. You know why we won our fights, and the Yanks struggled with theirs? One veteran reportedly told a historian. Because the Yanks wanted to be comfortable. They wanted their showers and their smokes and their candy bars. They wanted to bring America with them into the jungle. He shook his head. You cannot bring America into the jungle. The jungle does not care about America. The jungle only cares about what belongs and what does not. We learned to belong. The Yanks never did. There is a tendency in military history to focus on weapons and tactics, on formations and firepower. The big picture, the strategic view. But wars are won and lost in details that never make it into the textbooks. The smell of soap, the crinkle of a candy wrapper, the flare of a match in the darkness, the tiny mistakes that reveal position, that invite ambush, that turn routine patrols into casualties. The Australian SAS in Vietnam understood this at a visceral level. They understood that in their particular war, against their particular enemy, in their particular environment, the greatest weapon was absence. Absence of noise, absence of movement, absence of any smell that did not belong to the jungle that surrounded them. They became ghosts. They became nightmares. They became the thing that made hard men check their perimeters twice and sleep with one eye open. Not because they had better rifles or bigger bombs, because they disappeared. This is the legacy that modern Australian Special Forces inherit. Not just the tactics and the training, but the mindset, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for capability. The understanding that in warfare, less is often more. The knowledge that sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the world is no match for a man who has learned to smell like the mud. Bah! And so we return to the beginning. To the SAS trooper lying in the rotting undergrowth of Phuoc Tuy Province. His face caked with mud, his uniform stiff with filth, his nose calibrated to the jungle like an instrument of war. He smells the Americans before he sees them. He lets them pass. He does not move. He does not speak. He simply waits. Another piece of the jungle, indistinguishable from the rot and the moisture and the endless green. Later, when the patrol returns to base, and the men are hosed down, and the uniforms are burned, and the beer is cold, someone will ask him how he knew the Yanks were coming. He will shrug. He will take a long pull from his stubby, and he will say the only thing that needs to be said. They stink of soap. The diggers around him will nod. They will understand. And the young blokes just arrived from Australia will look at each other and wonder what they have gotten themselves into. They will learn soon enough. In the jungle, cleanliness is not next to godliness. Cleanliness is the enemy. Cleanliness gets you tracked and targeted and eliminated by men who have nothing but time and patience, and noses sharpened by a lifetime in the green hell. The Americans learned this lesson the hard way. The Australians learned it too. But they were willing to embrace it, to become it, to let the jungle claim their bodies so that their minds could stay sharp and their mates could stay alive. This is not a story about superior soldiers. The Americans had plenty of those. This is a story about adaptation, about a small force from a small country that understood with brutal clarity that survival meant becoming something other than what civilization had made them. It meant becoming dirty. It meant becoming patient. It meant becoming invisible. It meant, in the end, becoming the nightmare that the enemy whispered about in their camps at night. The Australians who came from nowhere. The Australians who smelled like the jungle. The Australians who were there, and then were gone, and left nothing but silence. That is the story of the SAS in Vietnam. That is why they kicked the Americans out of their patrols. And that is why, decades later, veterans still laugh when they remember the look on the Yankee officer's face when he was told the truth. You stink of soap, mate. And soap gets you noticed.